Great, thank you, April. So I just want to give a background in terms of who the Canadian Environmental Law Association is. We are a legal clinic that began in 1970, and we became an official legal aid clinic since 1978. What does that mean? We actually get our core funding from Legal Aid Ontario. So the province of Ontario provides that funding. We, as a clinic, actually use existing laws to protect the environment and advocate for improvements, basically protect human health and the environment. And our primary focus at CELA is to provide assistance to low-income and disadvantaged communities, particularly where it pertains to environmental health and safety. Our core mandate, as such, is to provide environmental justice and ensure adequate and effective public participation when it comes to environmental decision-making. Next slide, please, April. And so the overview for this particular presentation, and then I'll hand it off to Bev Thorpe, is to talk about informed substitution and alternative assessment in the context of chemical use in Canada. We'll talk about the goals and definition. We'll go into the Canadian framework, specifically focused on the Canadian Environmental Protection Act and the Chemicals Management Plan, and with a very focused discussion around risk management versus informed substitution. And then we'll go in and talk about 4 examples of where the benefits of alternative assessment might work, and to give us a sort of create the context by which we will have our discussions. And then we'll conclude by looking at what might be needed to fix the challenges that we're facing with chemicals use in Canada, and then conclude with a question and answer and discussion period. So I'm going to hand it off to Bev. If you can go on to the next slide, please, April.
Thank you so much, and I'll ask you to move the slides forward. Good old Zoom, but anyway, here we go. So it's my pleasure to be talking to you all today on something which I feel is a very dynamic time for chemicals policy. And this is to highlight the fact that Canada's current approach to chemicals management is mostly to reduce exposure and not to substitute hazardous chemicals with safer alternatives. As we all know, the Chemicals Management Plan and SEPA do have a risk management function, but to date, both the Chemical Management Plan and regulations of chemicals under SEPA is really based on this exposure reduction and risk management, which unfortunately tends to reinforce a business as usual approach to toxic chemical use, rather than a more forward solution-based innovation to actual safer chemical use. And this is why this webinar is going to talk about the sort of defined roadmaps to substitution with safer alternatives. And it's a timely time to do this webinar because, of course, Canada is now looking at how to better integrate a more preventive strategy through informed substitution of toxic chemicals. Next slide, please. So what is informed substitution? There are various definitions which all basically say the same thing, but the goal, of course, is to minimize unintended consequences of switching from one hazardous chemical to another without fully understanding the profile of these potential alternatives. And you can see here, I won't read it, this is but that's the full statement from the US EPA. But it's important to know that in this way, informed substitution is very, very different to chemical restrictions or bans, where, of course, as those of us in the chemicals world know, that chemicals may be eliminated from use, but if you're not considering what you're replacing it with, this often results in regrettable substitute or replacements with equal hazard. So one of the definitions of informed substitution, which I know is quoted a lot by Health Canada and Environment Canada in their submissions, is informed substitution is defined as the considered transition, this is where the informed comes in, from a chemical of particular concern to safer chemicals or non-chemical alternatives. Next, please. And here's just another expanded definition. I thought it would be useful to show what the Occupational Safety and Health Admin at the U.S. Department of Labor defines as informed substitution. Again, it's this whole issue, focus on replacing hazardous substances with safer alternatives. But as they sort of flesh out the definition, it involves identifying alternatives and evaluating their health and safety hazards, as well as the potential trade-offs and technical and economic feasibility. So it's a nice graphic that you can go on the website there that I've given you. Next, please. And this brings us into another very crucial definition for alternatives assessment, which is basically, it is the process for identifying and comparing potential chemical and non-chemical alternatives that can replace these chemicals of concern. And it's important to note that this is based on their hazards, the chemical hazards, their performance, and their economic viability. And a little graphic I put on this slide just shows you one of the many roadmaps that give users the step-by-step process by which you identify your chemical of concern, you list the alternatives, then you do a hazard chemical screen, you look at the technical and economic evaluation, and then at the end of the day, you also think, this is in a product, what kind of life cycle considerations do we need to think about? How does it get disposed of or recycled? And then you select the safer alternative. Next. And this is important, I believe, because let's see if we can move our little, oh, I can't move our little picture up. There. Because neither the chemical management plan nor SEPA actually requires informed substitution or alternative assessment measures. I can't underscore this enough as a problem that really needs fixing. In fact, under the CMP, a formal systematic evaluation of the hazards of alternatives is not carried out in any of the risk management phase of chemicals considered to be toxic. So what does this mean? We do have a whole priority substances list, but we do not require substitution planning for SEPA toxic chemicals. So the current priority substances list, as we all know, is about 4,300 some odd chemicals, are assessed to determine if any substances are toxic, but once a substance is found to be toxic, it then can be added to Schedule 1 of SEPA, and then it does face risk management action. But again, just to underscore, it does not require substitution or does not mandate the assessment of alternatives. Next, please. The value of alternatives assessment, just again to bring this back to an important point, is that it does drive a focus on solutions rather than never-ending discussions of how risky and how much can we reduce the risk. It really is about jumping to an innovative green chemistry future of inherently safer chemicals. And it does prioritize chemical hazard assessment over exposure control for any chemical alternative. And in many ways, as we see further on in the next slide, it does promote innovation and sustainable product design. So just to leave you with that really important value of alternative assessment. Next, please. And this is this lovely paperback, which I've been a huge fan of since it came out in 1999, Green Chemistry Theory and Practice by John Warner and co-authored. It is the 12 principles of green chemistry. It's highly readable, and I think it's really important for those of us in pushing safer chemicals to understand that what these 12 principles are. But in general, it is the set of principles that reduces the use or generation of hazardous substances at the beginning of chemical formulation. So the premise within green chemistry, and as many companies use this basis, is that the most effective means to reduce risk is to simply reduce the hazards of the chemicals. Risk is always a component of hazard and exposure. But I believe it's a false dichotomy to say you can't have one, you know, that you need to have both at the same equal measure. The whole issue is that if you reduce chemical hazards at the upfront design stage, you of course need to consider exposure, but you've already reduced the inherent hazards of chemicals. So I won't go into discussions about the Greenscreen for safer chemicals, but this is now a globally recognized chemical hazard assessment tool used by many, many corporations and businesses to help them first design out high hazards and then deal with the rest of considerations around product design. Next, please. One company that has been using this approach, and I wanted to put this slide in here, is that Hewlett-Packard really values this inherent hazard approach, and they indeed have been using Greenscreen for well over 10 years to replace PVC cables and chlorinated, brominated flame retardants in their products with inherently safer alternatives. Because as Helen Holder and Corey Robertson and the rest of the team at HP point out in this reference I've given you at the bottom of the slide, is that the basic premise of green chemistry is that chemical risk is most effectively managed by reducing hazards. And here's the clincher, as they point out, because exposure controls can and do fail, products are used in unintended ways, and end-of-life management of obsolete equipment is often problematic. HP, of course, with their electronic products, understands the problems of e-waste ending up in an uncontrolled burning, the generation of dioxin, etc. And through their elimination of halogenated chemicals, they know at least they're helping to prevent some of the worst unintended but end-of-life consequences of some of their products. So this is a line that we're seeing amongst many, many companies about simply reducing hazard in their chemical portfolio. Next, please. And I did have some animations here, but I can see this isn't going to work. So this is one flow chart which I think is really worth looking at in perspective, because it was designed in 2012 by the BizNGO working group. These are businesses, companies, and NGOs that looked at what is a good formula or flow chart for making decisions on alternatives assessment. So again, as we saw in some of the earlier slides, you simply first identify your chemical of concern, and then you look at how is it used, what's the function of the chemical. You then see what other alternatives are on the market, and if there are alternatives on the market, you then proceed to examine the chemical hazards of those alternatives to see if they are inherently safer. Then you look at their technical and economic performance. And finally, you look at that whole big life cycle thinking, including exposure concerns. So again, it's not an either or hazard exposure. It's simply, where do you prioritize the hazard assessment? And in alternatives assessment, you do find that you have to consider it upfront. Next, please. And I won't go through this in detail, but this is just, again, something that was actually quoted in a Health Canada report. Here's the link at the bottom, where they do talk about, they know the components of alternatives assessment. As they say, here's a snapshot of its components. And as said earlier on the BizNGO flowchart, you look at, start off with identifying the chemical of concern. And what I find interesting on the right column is that they do point out that you need to have stakeholders to engage with. It's very, very important in the whole alternatives assessment process that NGOs, innovators in safer chemicals, a wide range of companies are sitting at the table, not just trade associations or chemical producers. You need to have the downstream users and the innovators sitting around the table. And then, of course, you look at the hazard component, particularly as it affects vulnerable populations. You go through the technical economic feasibility, and on to final decision making. If you find that in some cases a suitable alternative may not be available, that's where the research and development kicks in, because these are urgent priorities to actually substitute out of hazardous chemicals. Next, please. And I also wanted to give you the Commons Alternatives Assessment Principles. This was also written up in 2012, 2013, where a group of academics, NGOs, and companies got together and said, you know, we need to have general principles of alternatives assessment. And I like these principles because they really do highlight the need for transparency. So there's the link, go to it. It's on the Toxic Use Reduction Institute website. Next slide, please. Let's talk about, here are the 6 principles. Again, reduce hazard, minimize your exposure, of course, use best available information. This is often a very tricky situation because, as we all know, we live in a universe of quite often insufficient data on the human health and environmental aspects or hazards of chemicals. And quite often this puts a roadblock in really understanding what is safer. Sometimes governments find it really hard to get the information from chemical producers. Sometimes there's confidential business information challenges, but it's absolutely crucial that we are making decisions based on best available information. And then, of course, it requires disclosure and huge transparency to make the assumptions that are used in the decision-making very, very, very transparent. So again, the principles emphasize this need for disclosure and transparency in that whole alternative assessment process. And then finally, you take action. It's very action-oriented, solution-based process. Next, please. And I won't go through the many guidance, but there's so many guidance on alternatives assessment that this is just one of them, which has some nice flow charts. It's been updated recently. So many people have been working on alternatives assessment. Next slide, please. And the point I was making here is that hopefully these and other frameworks that clearly lay out these roadmaps will help clarify the path forward for the chemical management plan and Health Canada, Environment Canada. And the reason why I put this slide in is because earlier this year at a presentation on alternative assessment, Health Canada produced a slide showing how difficult, you know, there were so many complexities with identifying and evaluating substitutes. And I found that there was absolutely no mention of substitutes actually have lower hazard, which I found quite discomforting, which is something that we need to make sure that, yes, there are flow charts and hazard is as an absolute priority when we're going through all these different decision making. Next, please. So the CMP Science Committee and SEPA, this is the report that I had a look at, and it does recommend that SEPA itself be amended to add a mandatory duty to assess alternatives as part of all screening assessments of existing substances, and a mandatory substitution test to ensure that decisions are based on information with a goal of replacing toxic substances with safer alternatives. So the last flurry of reports that have been coming through in 2017, 2018, I know a lot of folks on this call have been putting in submissions to really push the reforms that are needed in SEPA. This was a very interesting report to see that there is acknowledgement that things need to move to more alternative assessment. Next, please. This is just a snapshot. Thank you to Faye for providing this one. It just gives the whole sort of opportunities for public engagement in the current risk management flowchart of what SEPA deals with at the moment. You can see that there's a consideration of risk management options, and then you have the development of tools and socioeconomic impact analysis. But even though there's these opportunities to take part in public input from the little yellow bubbles at the bottom, keep in mind that quite often, as this webinar pointed out at the beginning, quite often it's about exposure reduction. And it's not really about assessing alternatives and focusing on how do we find informed substitution measures out of these chemicals. It's usually about, let's try to minimize the exposure and deal with a dilution impact. So it's useful to see, is there a way that we could actually amend this kind of a process? And I know Sheila and others have sent in amendments along these lines. Next slide, please. I just wanted to throw in 2 slides on the European REACH regulation because it had such a global impact. Under the REACH regulation, which is the registration, evaluation, and authorization plus restriction of hazardous chemicals that came in about 2007, we've had over 10 years of experience on seeing how the European Chemical Agency is working with member states in the whole of the European area to phase out substances of very high concern. And the way they're doing that is that the goal is that those chemicals that are listed as substances of very high concern, the idea is to control them and eventually and progressively replace them by suitable alternatives. And this is a prescribed requirement under REACH. Next, please. So what does that mean? If companies want or try to say, look, we need to use a substance of very high concern, they have to apply for an authorization, which is given to them if they can achieve certain criteria, but the authorization is for a very specific time-limited and very specific application of that chemical. To get an authorization for a substance of very high concern, a user first would have to demonstrate they can adequately control it for specific applications. Quite often this is very, very difficult to do, and if it's a very persistent and very bioaccumulative substance, they're not even allowed to use that adequate control process. So if they can't show adequate control, they could potentially still be authorized to use it if they can show socioeconomic benefits outweigh the risk to human health, and there are no suitable alternative substances. All of this is done through a mandatory substitution plan that companies have to submit to the European Chemical Agency, and there have been a few authorizations, some of which have been challenged by member states saying that actually alternatives were available. But I won't go into the REACH authorization. The main point I want to leave you with is that it is a useful framework by which you are putting the onus on companies to show that they have looked and there are no suitable alternatives. One of the things that has come out recently in the last couple of months is that innovators and green chemistry promoters and some companies that do have alternatives to substances of very high control are demanding a bigger place at the table when these authorization applications are happening. So good news for innovators in Europe. Next one, please. And it's not just the substitution planning, but of course the European Chemical Agency has a lot of support structures to help move the European economy to safer chemicals adoption. And this is just a snapshot from their website, which shows they have supply chain workshops so that all the stakeholders in supply chain are talking to each other. There's a lot of funding and technical support to help companies develop more safer alternatives. And of course, the whole focus on getting more data to help companies avoid regrettable substitutes. Next slide, please. So a lot of the, I know Health Canada, Environment Canada has been doing a lot of commissioning of reports from University of Massachusetts Lowell, 2017 and 2018, and I think ongoing communication with the folks there at UMass Lowell. I just wanted to put 2 slides. Their 2017 report did recommend that you need regulatory restrictions for mandatory substitution planning. But as they point out, that on its own, you also need to have this combination of voluntary approaches on incentives and guidance and support and tools. This is absolutely crucial. I know sometimes people look at Massachusetts Toxic Use Reduction Act and say, what an amazing achievement. Let's just move this into the province of Ontario. But if you don't have the backup incentives and technical support and tools and, you know, real hands-on community, you just basically have a piece of legislation. So one of the things that came to mind when I was looking at this was, from my memory, is that here in Canada, we did declare perchloroethylene, commonly used solvent in dry cleaning, to be SEPA toxic in 2000. And I was very excited when the federal government did a really comprehensive report on all the viable alternatives to perc use. But because there was no training or implementation of wet cleaning options, which was the preferred alternative that was noted by the feds, because of that lack of communication, I know that inspectors were going around to dry cleaning shops recommending perc recycling machines to lower exposures, which is very, very different to what the Toxic Use Reduction Institute was doing with the dry cleaners in the state of Massachusetts. So just to underscore, we need to have this package. It's not just enough to require a plan. Next, please. And again, just on the 2018 report, they did talk again and emphasize, this is again a UMass Lowell report, that one of the ways to really facilitate alternatives assessment is to simply do what companies themselves do, which is they don't look at a chemical by chemical approach. They look at the function of what they're trying to do. So a chemical is designated a chemical of high concern. Well, what is that chemical function? Is it a preservative? Is it a solvent? Does it give stain repellency to textiles? Is it a degreaser? What is it? And that's how designers then start their search for alternatives. So if we could simply get more product-based in Canada, I think we'd go a long way towards really opening up a more valuable discussion on alternatives assessment. And again, as they emphasize again, you need to have this really good collaboration between the government departments and the supply chain, NGOs, scientific communities, etc. Again, emphasizing the supply chain, we need to have downstream users at the table. We need to have the suppliers at the table, because they're the ones that can quite often innovate. And all this just to say is that companies are always looking for information about what is next coming down the pipeline. So the quicker we can start talking about chemicals that need to be replaced, the quicker you'll see innovation. Next, please. So let's go into 4 just little examples here. The first one, as we all know, is bisphenol A. Here in Canada, we banned them in polycarbonate baby bottles in 2010, and that was it. In fact, I don't believe there was even any alternatives assessment requirements in the restriction on BPA in baby bottles. So now, what about bisphenol A and other applications, including not just BPA, but some of the alternatives that we know companies simply jumped into, knowing it wasn't unregulated? And we understand that Canada is considering assessing the larger group of bisphenols, including BPS, which was an unfortunate substitute because it has similar endocrine disrupting properties as BPA. We know that they're going to start looking at this as early as 2020, but again, you know, what's the format that they're using? Are they going to look at alternatives? Are they going to look at substitution plans? Next one, please. And I wanted to just compare this to the regulatory action in Europe, where BPA is restricted in thermal paper on the market, effective next month. And the way that this was signaled to companies was it was declared a substance of very high concern in 2017 due to the endocrine disrupting properties of BPA. And as the graph shows here, you immediately saw that the decline in the production of thermal paper containing BPA has started in Europe. It's really important to know that receipts are the single largest source of exposure to BPA for humans. And every time I go through cash machines, I'm wondering how protective are workers? Are they even aware that they need to be wearing gloves or washing their hands when they handle these thermal papers? Next, please. So what about available substitutes? A study that was done by the Europe Environmental Protection Agency in the US in 2014, did assess 19 alternatives to BPA, and they found that it was challenging to successfully substitute BPA from both a hazard, inherent hazard, and technical functionality. And so therefore research and development was urgently needed. The fact that the EU restriction went ahead, you saw a lot of innovation within the supply chain, both for drop-in chemical substitutions and alternative technologies, so that you know, papers and receipts are being printed with a different kind of process, not just with a chemical coating in the paper. Now you're seeing UK and other European retailers are adopting completely bisphenol-free receipt paper. It's hit the market. Here in Canada, Costco Canada claims they'll be bisphenol-free by the end of this year. And I just put in a little quote here at the bottom that a lot of it was due to a coordinated NGO pressure on retailers here in Canada, Loblaws, Metro, Sobeys, Walmart, as well as Costco in August 2019 to get out of bisphenols. Next, please. The next example is back to our good old per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. These chemicals that are used for stain resistance and water repellency, and we all, 99% of Canadians have these chemicals in our bodies. We have, the situation unfortunately is that we have many unregulated PFAS used in Canada, which is permitting regrettable substitutions, and again with very long-term impacts to the environment and human health. And this is because SEPA does restrict some long-chain PFAS, but requires no publicly available alternatives assessment of other PFAS. And what industry has done is simply to move from long-chain into short-chain PFAS molecules, which are just as persistent, and we now find out are very, very mobile in water systems. So the point here is not just that we need to get out of this class of chemicals, but also the circular economy has become increasingly a driver to restrict the entire chemical class of PFAS, because as the CELA report points out, done earlier this year, here's the link at the bottom, is there's a lack of data in Canada for how PFAS is used in textiles and paper applications. At the same time, we hear calls for increased recycling of carpets, increased recycling of textiles, you know, increased recycling of paper. But if these products contain PFAS, we're simply perpetuating a very toxic material cycle. So the circular economy, you can't have proponents of increased recycling without looking at hazardous chemicals and materials. And PFAS is one example that really needs urgent attention in Canada. Next, please. So compare this to California's Safer Consumer Products Program, which as the product program emphasizes, is about products, identifies products that contain potentially harmful chemicals, and it asks manufacturers to look for replacements using alternatives analysis. And again, they are really pushing for high rates of carpet recycling in California, which is why they're paying so much attention to PFAS in carpets. And the schematic on the right just shows, this is taken from the Department of Toxic Substances Control in California, why carpet became a priority product, because of course of exposure in the homes, but also in landfill waste. It just circulates back into our environment, into our air, into our groundwater, sludge, etc. Next, please. So what they've done is they've targeted the elimination of the entire class of PFAS in textiles and leather. This means that it would require manufacturers of these products, PFAS-containing treatments used on textiles or leathers such as carpets, upholstery, clothing, and shoes, to either stop selling in California or to conduct an alternatives analysis to determine if there is a safer substitute. Now, one of the reasons why the department went ahead and chose textiles and leather, PFAS-containing textiles and leather, was simply because they had sat down with product designers and knew that they had already either moved off PFAS or had found other alternatives to PFAS in carpets and rugs and textiles. So it's a nice sort of, it shows how good collaboration with innovators and solution providers really can help move this type of regulation forward. Next, please. And then just to finish on PFAS, the city of San Francisco has now banned the use of PFAS in food packaging because alternatives are available. And actually, the reason why they push this is that they found that PFAS in food packaging was contaminating their compost. So they knew they needed to get out of some of the compostable food packaging, keep their compost relatively clean, but also they just knew alternatives existed. So as of 1st of January, 2020, restaurants, food retailers, etc., and city departments will all be subject to the requirements. So municipalities can take really good action on alternatives assessment and informed substitution. And just to emphasize that states are also moving forward. In this case, the state of Washington has also passed a law prohibiting these substances in food contact materials. And again, they're doing a lot of scoping on availability of safer alternatives. Next, please. Third one is flame retardants. This is a great, I take my hat off to the folks at the Endocrine Disruptors Action group that have highlighted the problems of flame retardants in Canada. And again, we don't have a focus on products. We're trying to deal with how toxic is Deca PBDE or Penta BDE, etc. Instead of that, which means that we are do not apply the restrictions on these class of chemicals, flame retardants, to consumer products or parts of products. And so we have a big problem with the import of upholstery containing these chemicals and continuing to provide a big exposure problem. Next, please. In comparison, again, compare this to the state of Maine's ban on all flame retardants in upholstered furniture in 2017. They not only said we need a phase out of brominated flame retardants, they just said we don't need any toxic flame retardants in upholstered furniture. They knew that there was ways to meet flammability standards without the use of these chemicals. And as they point out in their press releases, this avoids regrettable substitution in which alternatives to brominated or halogenated flame retardants could be used, such as the phosphorus-based ones. Secondly, it does help push back on the chemical industry's lobbying against California's decision to no longer require flame retardant chemicals in residential upholstered furniture. Important to note that this law went through with massive support by the firefighters unions and the Firefighters Association. So again, it's really important that these kind of stakeholders and vulnerable populations are at the table when discussing phase out of hazardous chemicals. Next, please. And again, the Department of Ecology in Washington State has, they're also jumping into the full regulation of classes, of whole classes of chemicals in consumer products. Again, this focus on products. Again, highlighting that chemical restrictions do require safer alternatives be feasible and available. Department of Ecology is doing a lot of great research on certain priority products, which is detailed a bit more on the next slide. Next slide, please. Here, the law will require Department of Ecology in Washington State to act on products containing chemicals of high concern. Here again is our PFAS in carpet and carpet treatments. We also see phthalates in cosmetic fragrances, vinyl flooring, bisphenols in laundry detergent, thermal paper, can linings. Really happy to see a focus on BPA use in can linings. And then finally with the flame retardants in electronics and foam, kids products and building insulation. What does this do? The law requires that the department establish its final list of priority products by June next year, and then it has 2 years to determine a regulatory response. The beauty of listing these products and these chemicals of high concern right now is that, it's sending a clear focus to product designers and innovators to move off these chemicals. Next, please. And then finally, to end, good old triclosan, our antimicrobial, highly used everywhere. When the Canadian Environmental Law Association decided to really dig into this back in 2014, the result was a great report called Chemicals in Consumer Products Are Draining Trouble into the Great Lakes Ecosystem. On the left, you can see all the problems with triclosan that had been building up over the year. And we knew at the time that SEPA was trying to figure out how to deal with triclosan. So CELA put in a real big piece of work on needing to do an alternatives assessment to phase out triclosan, but also to avoid regrettable substitutes. Next slide, please. And the upshot was that CELA commissioned Greenscreen assessments of both triclosan and a common substitute, triclocarban, to show that both had very high aquatic toxicity for the functional use of triclosan. How is triclosan used? It's used a lot in chemicals that go down the drain. So it's really important that we focused on how toxic is it to the aquatic ecosystem. Subsequent presentations by CELA in Ottawa to Environment Canada, Health Canada, and then supplemented with a delivery of this NGO triclosan statement from over 50 organizations. I'm sure many of you on the phone signed this, really did push, tried to push a precautionary substitution response from the government. What was the upshot? Next slide. The government response is that they decided to achieve a 30% reduction of triclosan in the environment. And they did this by issuing a pollution prevention planning notice under SEPA, with industry itself required to develop and implement the plans. Again, there was no transparent requirement for alternatives assessment. In the pollution prevention plan, the government points out that while some of the substances discussed above, they did talk about some of the alternatives on the market, may have a function similar to triclosan in certain application. They point out to companies it's important to know that most have not been assessed under SEPA and could be risk assessed and risk management if deemed necessary in the future. You know, this gives a really vague set of information to companies. It would have been much better to done what the EPA tends to do, which is let's just assess the hazards of alternatives and see where we stand. And again, there was no focus on informed substitution for an eventual phase out of triclosan. The government seems as though a 30% reduction achieves their goal. So finally, the last slide. I think it's the last slide. Yes, what is needed? I think really what needs is that we need to have actually reform SEPA to incorporate mandatory planning with this additional support, collaboration, etc. But we need to have mandatory reform within SEPA. And I've noticed that CELA has submitted amendments along these lines that also reflect the Science Committee recommendations and the Standing Committee recommendations. This is just a little cut and paste from the amendment to SEPA submission, which is at the bottom of your screen. Again, the substitution principle has been defined and is being pushed within the reform that's needed within SEPA. And finally, I would also say that we just need to have much greater expertise within the chemical management plan and Environment Canada and Health Canada and all the regulatory bodies that need to move away from this risk management expertise to really understanding the kinds of guidance and information and new structures that are coming through to help us move to a much more informed substitution and transparent way forward within our chemicals management plan. So the last slide is simply a Q&A, but also can you if we'll just go to the last slide, because I think Faye did want to acknowledge the funders and who have helped facilitate this webinar and made all this work possible. So over to you and Faye. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Bev. And what I'll do is I'll have April guide us through, we'll open it up for questions, clarifications, and certainly I think we've set aside enough time to allow for a discussion. And certainly the purpose, as Bev mentioned, she's given some opportunities or identified opportunities where the Canadian framework could be improved within the context of incorporating a framework for informed substitution, and mostly on the basis of the fact that our current framework doesn't work so great to protect environment and human health from a lot of the hazardous chemicals that we see out in the market. So really the intent of this particular webinar is to encourage that dialogue with the aspiration to seek changes to the federal approach to chemicals management in Canada. I'll hand it over to April just to get a sense of whether there's interest in asking questions for clarification and then deep dive into some of the issues that are coming up for people.
Sure. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording right here so that we have the presentation section to share with everyone. So there we go. And what I'm going to do in just a second is actually unmute everyone's lines. So I have a little magic button I can hit, unmutes everybody's lines. There's probably going to be quite a bit of noise and feedback for just a moment, so be patient. And what I'll ask is that you mute your own line individually for now, and then we'll take kind of one question at a time. You can unmute your line when you have a question. We don't have an option to raise a virtual hand in this platform. So again, I will unmute all the lines. Please remute yourself unless you have a question, in which case you're more than welcome to leave your line open. And I will have to mute people if we have like a ton of feedback on their lines, okay? So be patient. We're just gonna unmute everyone right now. There we go. Oh, not too bad. Oh, a little bit of echoing. Not too bad. Good. Sometimes you open it up and you get all kinds of conversations and all kinds of background noise, but not too bad. Okay, so we have one question in the chat box from Donald, but I believe that your line is unmuted now, Donald, if you wanted to go ahead and ask your question of our panelists.
Yeah, I found this a very interesting and enjoyable presentation and quite clear. Frankly, a lot clearer than what you get from CMP, I think, in the sense that there's a bit more detail